been studying the book of Genesis. For more than a year now. We started with Genesis 1:1, and we're now all the way up to the story of Abram or Abraham, depending on what point of his life you pick up the story. So we are now in Genesis 13, and here on my rough map that I have drawn, let's review just where Abram has been already, and then we're going to pick up with one of the stories from Abram's life, one of the stories that deals with his interaction with his sort of ne'er-do-well nephew named Lot. But let's pick this up first. Remember, the story of Abram begins, and this is the Holy Land. Just for orientation here, this is the Sea of Galilee. Out of the Sea of Galilee flows the Jordan River, and the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea. And so over here will be the Mediterranean Sea, and we'll fill in some things as we go. You come all the way down, so this is the northern part of Palestine. Jerusalem's right down here, midway, and then pointing in this direction right here, this is the way to Egypt. Now, let's begin with the beginning of Abram's life, and it begins over here in the Mesopotamian Valley. It begins with a city called Ur of the Chaldees. And to an idolater in Ur, God comes. Abram, the main religion of Ur was the worship of the moon god. And we know from the book of Joshua that Abram and his father Terah were idolaters. So it's not like God comes to the most faithful believer in the land of Ur and says, I want to call you out to do something special. Abram, well, when God first came to him, was worshipped an idol. God did come to him. We're not told exactly how that looked or in what form it was, but God did tell Abram, I want you to get up and leave where you are. I want you to leave your family, and I want you to go to a place where I will show you. Just imagine if God were to tell you that. If God were to appear to you and say, I want you to move. I'll tell you where. Leave everybody you know and or order up a moving van, and when they get here and get your stuff loaded, why, just tell them, head out toward the west and we'll figure out where we're going. That's essentially Abram. Now, they left Ur, and he didn't leave his family. He took part of his family with him. He took his father, and he took his nephew, Lot. Now, Terah was the patriarch of the family at that time until he died. Terah had 3 sons, Haran, son number 2, I'll think in a minute, and the son number 3 was Abram. Haran died. So Abram's brother dies, and he has a son named Lot. And since Lot did not have a father, Lot sort of took up with Abram, and Abram sort of took the position of his father. And so when Abram left Haran, he left with his father, and he left with his nephew, Lot. The first place they went was right up here, and it was called Haran. Probably Terah was from Haran originally and had named his son after the city where he was from. And so there was Haran the son, who's now dead, and Haran the city. And so they went to Haran first, and Terah did not want to leave. And so Abram, being the dutiful son, stayed with his father for several years. I think it was 5 years, until his father dies. And when his father Terah dies, that leaves Abram and Lot and their servants and parts of their household. Abram was a man of some wealth. He is not like the wealth that he is to become. He is going to end up being the Bill Gates of Palestine, a fabulously wealthy man, but he has some wealth at this point. So when his father dies, now God comes back to him and said, remember what I told you in Ur? I'm still going to do it. You follow me, do what I tell you to, and I'm going to lead you into a land that I'm going to give you. And so they head on over into the land. They stop first at a place called Shechem. And that's where God now reveals what's called the Abrahamic covenant. And the Abrahamic covenant is God's agreement with Abraham. It's what God tells Abraham, or Abram at that point, what God tells Abram he's going to do for him. Later, this will be restated several times. He stated it first here in Ur. He stated it again in Haran. He states it again when they get into the promised land. That was in Genesis chapter 12. And so he restates it. And remember, there's three characteristics of the covenant. One is a land. Number two is a seed. And number three is a blessing. If you remember land, seed, and blessing, you understand the Abrahamic covenant. Land, I'm going to give you a physical place. The land where I will give you, I'm going to give you this land. This will be yours. Oddly enough, Abram never possessed it. He had a son eventually named Isaac, and Isaac had the covenant renewed to him, but he never possessed the land. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob had the covenant renewed to him, but he never possessed the land. And God told Abram, not in the passage we'll look at today, but later on told Abram, this land is a land that I'm going to give you eventually. Look around. At one point he says, hey, Abram, look around. Walk around the land. See what it is that you're going to get eventually. Just sort of like if you're buying a new house, and they're building it, one of the things you do is you always go out and look at it, and you see it when the foundation goes up, and you see it as the walls begin to go up, and you're saying, in effect, this is going to be my house. I'm going to own it. I'm going to live in it. In the meantime, I come check it out frequently. That's exactly what Abram did. He was checking out the land, but God told him, it's yours, but you're not going to possess it in your lifetime. And so God told him, eventually I will send you off, and they did. He sent them off to Egypt when Joseph was in Egypt, and they became slaves after Joseph. And what God was doing is he was building the country. He was taking them to a land where they were not a part of the land, not a part of the culture. They were seen as slaves in the culture. And in the meantime, he was saying, it's going to take me a while for me to bring you back, because the iniquity of the Amorites, the iniquity of the people who live in the land, is not yet full. They're getting worse and worse and worse and worse. I'm going to take you out of the land in a place where there'll be no temptation to intermarry. In a place where you're a foreigner in the land. I'm going to take you out, and when these people are ripe, when they're ready to be judged, they're getting worse and worse and worse, and when it gets to the point that I'm going to judge them, then I'll bring you back into the land, and at that point you will possess the land as I have told you in this covenant. And he brought him back into the land under Moses. And so at that point became the time when it was time for them to possess the land little by little. And even then, God did not say, okay, I'm just going to kill all these people and you come in, or I'll drive them out, or whatever. He said, I want you to possess it, but you'll possess it city by city and area by area. But it's all going to be yours. And the Abrahamic covenant itself, later on, as we will see, when God actually gives them the dimensions. Right now, he says this land, but later on, he gives them the dimensions of the land. He says from here on the east to here in the west, from here in the north to here in the south, and the whole dimensions of the land were essentially from here in Egypt all the way over through what is modern-day Iraq, from Turkey all the way down through Saudi Arabia. All that is theirs. Even under the days of David and Solomon, they never possessed the land that God told Abram that he was going to give him. That will be the land. That will be, I believe, the dimensions of the nation of Israel when King Jesus returns to set up his kingdom here on earth. So that's Israel. But so at a point in the future, that will be the land of Israel. So in chapter 12, he renews that covenant. He says a land, a seed, which must have been really tough for Abram to hear, because at this point, Abram was in his 70s and he was childless. Sarai, his wife, was barren. They could not have children. And so when Abram first got the word about the covenant was back here in Ur, and he was in his 60s. And at that point, they had already given up on children. And now God says, I'm going to give you a family. 5 years later, in Haran, God comes and says, again, I'll give you a seed. She's still barren. Here in the land now, God says, I'll give you a seed. And nothing happens. There are times when God says, I'm going to do something. And we think, oh boy, this is what God's going to do. And yet nothing happens. The reason is that more than giving a land, God wanted to build Abram as a man of faith. He ended up doing that. And so in the New Testament, whenever we talk about Abram, or Abraham as we now call him, we always see Abraham as synonymous with faith. And the only way God can build faith is through testing. The only way you can't build muscles by sitting around and hoping for them or watching YouTube videos. You have to put pressure. You have to strain, and you have to increase the pressure over a period of time with weights to build muscles. The same way spiritually, the only way to build faith, because faith is believing God will do what he said he would do. Faith is just believing God. So God says, here's what I'm going to do. And you say, yes, I believe that. And the only way to build that is for God to say, here's what I'm going to do. And then not do it right then. And it's easy when God says, here's what I'm going to do. Here it is. And you say, that's wonderful. But if God says, here's what I'm going to do, and there's no here it is, and you don't see it, and you have to wait. And so, it's one thing for me to say, I'm holding a marker in my hand. Here it is. I can see it, touch it, taste it. I can take the top off of it. I can smell it. There's no faith there. But if I tell you, here's a marker in my hand, and you can't see it, if you believe that, it must be because you have faith that I'm telling you the truth, even though you can't see it. That's the definition of faith. Okay. Faith, Hebrews says, is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And so when you can see it, you don't have faith. But when all you have is what God said, not what you can see, not what you can touch, not what you can taste, not what you can feel, and say, I can't see it, touch it, taste it, feel it. I have no evidence that it's true, but I believe it anyway. That's faith. And so the seed was the fact that God said, I'm going to give you a child. but he didn't see it yet. He said, I'm going to give you a blessing. I will bless you. I will pour out my blessings. And we see that throughout the entire history of Abram. We see God pouring out his blessings. But not only that, well, he said, I will bless you. I'll bless you with children. I'll bless you with other things. And as I said, he made, for one thing, he made Abram the richest man that the world had known up until that point. But he said also, I'm going to bless those who bless you. And if somebody curses you, I will curse them. And that is still true, I think, of the nation Israel. So that's where we were. He got into the land. He had the promises, renewed that. And as soon as they got into the land, he's finally to the place where God has told him all this time, I want you to go. So now he's in the land. He gets there, and there's nothing to eat. There's no food. So Abram has himself, his family, servants, etc., and there's no food in the land. So God put him up in a place where there was a famine. And so now he's got basically a choice. Am I going to stay here and trust that God would not bring me here to starve? Or am I going to go find food somewhere, anywhere? He chose option B. And he headed on through the land and went down to Egypt, which was a place God never told him to go. He never asked God about it. He never prayed about it. He never sought for what God would want him to do. He just headed to a place where he had heard that there was food. He got down to Egypt and immediately had the problem that the Egyptians, when they saw a beautiful woman coming in, the rulers of Egypt would frequently take that woman to join their harem. Now, if the woman was with her father or with a family member, they would pay a dowry for that woman. If you refuse, you may be killed. And so Abram, once he gets into the land, knows immediately that Sarai, who is 65 years old and gorgeous. I mean, I don't know what kind of beauty products they had in those days. I imagine really that this was still the time when people lived much longer than normal lives. It had been cut down after the flood, but people still typically live lives into the couple of hundred years. And so it could have been that the aging process had not caught up with where we are right now. But Abram was really concerned that we're going to get there and they're going to kill me to get you. And so he goes to Sarai and says, if someone asks, tell them you're my sister. Which was technically true because Sarai was his half-sister. Sarai was the daughter. Abram was the son of Terah, and Sarai was the daughter of Terah by a different wife. And so she was his half-sister. And he said, tell them you're my sister. And Sarai, at this point, was trusting God more than Abraham because she believed, okay, I'll go along with this. And I will trust God to take care of it. We don't know what Abram had in mind. Was he just thinking, I'm going to save my life, and if need be, I will just leave Sarai, my wife, here with Pharaoh? We don't know what his thinking was. Was he thinking that once she got into the house, maybe I'll try to steal her away and get her? We don't know. The Bible does not fill in that part of the story. All we know is that Pharaoh came and took her and paid Abram. Abram was a wealthy man. He gave him even more for Sarai. He took Sarai into his house, and God sent a plague, and we don't know the nature of the plague, but some kind of disease he sent on Pharaoh's house. And some way, and again, this is not told us, some way it could be that Sarai tells Pharaoh, but Pharaoh finds out that Sarai is Abram's wife, and so he goes back and he brings her back and he says, take her, God has smitten me with a plague, get out of here. And so they give Abram even more at that point. So they give him even more wealth so he'll be happy. So this God that has plagued him with whatever was going on, so that God will remove it. And God does remove it as Abram now takes his wife and moves back into the land. So he left. He went in because of unbelief. God blessed him even then. It blessed him with more wealth than he had. But you know, frequently when you go off and do your own thing because of unbelief, there are things that you have to carry with you. There are results, even though God has forgiven us, there are results that we have coming out of that unbelief. One of the results coming out of this was a maidservant that the family of Abram picked up in Egypt. And that maidservant's name was Hagar. And because of, and we see within a couple of chapters, the things that are going to happen because of Hagar's presence in the home. Things that, again, cause Abram to go into unbelief. But the presence of Hagar caused the issues, but Hagar should never have been there because Hagar came from Egypt and he should have never been in Egypt. But anyway, God forgives him. He comes back into the land and again builds an altar to God. And let's see what happens at this point. We are now in Genesis chapter 13. Again, we'll go through it verse by verse. And it begins with what happened at the end of the story of going to Egypt. So, chapter 13, verse 1. So, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, and the Negev just refers to the south of Israel. It's a term that you will hear even today. And so, if this right here is the promised land, the south of the promised land is a desert area, and it's called the Negev. And so, he went up from Egypt first into the Negev, as you would expect, coming back from Egypt. He and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. He went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where he pitched his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. So Bethel is just north of, here's Jerusalem right in here. Bethel is just north of this. So Bethel, and then there's another little city named Ai. Ai will become important later on because right next to Ai is Jericho. And when Joshua crosses the Jordan going in to take the land, the first city he comes into right next to the Jordan is Jericho. And that's where the walls came tumbling down. And right after Jericho, the next city was Ai, spelled A-I. And so that was the next city they had to encounter. And that's a story for a different class. But between Bethel and Ai, and Bethel just means a house of God. Anything, as we said, anything in Hebrew that ends in L-E-L has the name of God in it. So Israel, Daniel, Bethel. It means the L in Bethel is God. Beth means house of. Okay. Bethlehem means house of bread. So the term Beth referring to the house of, and El meaning God. So he goes to between. So here's Bethel. Here's Ai. And sort of see that as Arlington and Grand Prairie. And so he doesn't go to Arlington, he doesn't go to Grand Prairie, but he finds him some land out near 360 someplace, and he camps there. Because one thing that Abram did not do was Abram did not live in the cities. He did not go to the Canaanite cities, something that his nephew did not learn from him. But he did not go to the cities. He was a herdsman. He was a cattle baron with all kinds of herds of different kinds. And he was nomadic, so he moved around from place to place. And he typically set up shop outside those cities. So he went to some place between Bethel and Ai, and set up his tents there, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly. And there Abram called on the name of Yahweh. And so again, they knew in those days. Later on in the law, the sacrifices would be laid out in terms of here's what you're to do, what you're to sacrifice, etc. But even then, they understood about the sacrificial system. And they understood that there needed to be a sacrifice for sin, and that sacrifice needed to be an animal, and the animal had to die because the wages of sin is death. The only way to overlook sin would be if you must approach God through a sacrifice. So whenever you see the word altar, altar means basically a place where you kill an animal. Verse 5, now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. Lot was also a rich man, not as much as Abram, but Lot was also rich. He had, over a period of time, amassed his own house and his retinue and his servants, etc. And so there arose a problem between the herdsmen watching over Abram's flocks with those watching over Lot's. Verse 6, and the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great, and they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land. This would be typical. I mean, we've had this out in the American West a lot, where you have cattle barons who live next to each other. The idea about where is my grazing land, where is yours? There's water here. Who has access to the water? Who has first access to it? Can I bring my animals through this land, etc.? There's always that problem whenever you have two big ranching / herding operations next to each other. And Abram and Lot obviously got along well, but their herdsmen didn't necessarily. And finally, they had to get together and talk about what are we going to do about this problem of who has access to this water, who has access to this grazing land, etc. Because both of them were growing in wealth, and they were getting more and more sheep and cattle and goats and the other animals that they kept. Verse 7, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and Lot's, and then the Canaanite and the Perizzite. I don't know why that stuck in at that point. It could be that there was consciousness on their part that these heathen Canaanites were observing what's going on, that our herdsmen are fighting with each other, arguing, not getting along, and this is a really poor witness in front of these people. We need to do something about it. Verse 8, so Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Not literally brothers. Abraham was his uncle, but brothers of the same family in that respect. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate me from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if to the right, then I will go to the left. This was odd because, remember, this was a patriarchal society. And the patriarch of the family, and now that Terah's dad, Abram, was, the patriarch of the family had all the rights in the family. Really a life of death or death kind of power in the family. And so for the patriarch of the family to ask his nephew, what do you want to do? If you want to go that way, I'll go the other way. It was Abram's right to choose, not Lot's. And so the way you would normally think this would work is that Abram would look and see what he wanted and say, here's where I'm going, you go someplace else. But notice what Abram did, and maybe this was a trusting God too, I don't know. But Abram said to Lot, okay, it's a big land. I'll give you first choice. Amazing that he did that. He said, I'll give you first choice. You go any direction, north, south, east, west, wherever you don't go, that's the direction I'll go. And we'll separate our cattle empires. Verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before Yahweh destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of Yahweh, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. And again, he's noticing that this is a lot like Egyptian land. And remember that Egypt, this area of Egypt down here, was extremely fertile. That's the reason why Abram went there when there was a famine in the land. This is the Nile Delta. Extremely fertile. Later on, when there was going to be a famine in Egypt, this is the place where Joseph built his barns and collected things so that later on they would go down to Egypt again, ended up being slaves in Egypt. Why? Because of the fertility of this land. So when Lot looked at the Jordan Valley, and remember, okay, Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea, the Jordan River flows out of the Sea of Galilee into the Dead Sea. And so on either side of the Jordan River are mountains. Not like Rocky Mountains, but there are mountains on either side of it. And so that's why this was a valley, and as valleys frequently are, it was lush. It was great for farming, great for pasture lands, etc. And it said, Lot looked over here and he saw that this area was, he chose the best. When Abram gave him the choice, he didn't say, well, you know, Abram, you're the ark, you brought me here, I wouldn't even be for you, so you take the choice. He didn't. He said, okay, if that's the way you want to do it, then I will look over here and I'll take the very best. And so he went over into this area in the Jordan Valley and on down. Remember, they were nomadic. And Sodom and Gomorrah both were down here. And so it's in this area here next to the Dead Sea and in the Jordan Valley that he ends up going to. And notice that there's a sort of a parenthetical thing. Remember, this is Moses who's writing this many years later, who said that he chose for himself the valley of the Jordan, and let's see, it was well watered everywhere. It was before Yahweh destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So even then, Moses is trying to say this was the same. He chose the land that would ultimately be destroyed. Verse 12, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. And so he started off here in the Jordan Valley, ending up moving down here to the nation of Sodom. And the King James Bible says he pitched his tents towards Sodom. He started off sort of in the suburbs of Sodom. Now it's really interesting if you look over in chapter 14, just keep your finger there, but look over in 14 verse 12. Later on when there was a raid against the city, and it said they took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. So he started off with the well-watered land where there was the great pasture land, everything like this. This was also an area even then that was notorious for its wickedness. He ended up living outside Sodom, maybe because of the trading opportunities in Sodom, maybe because his family wanted the amenities of living near a great city like that. So he started off living outside of Sodom, but a little bit later, when Sodom was actually invaded by an invading army, they ended up taking Lot captive. Why? He was living in the city. So first he lived here, and then here, and then here, and ultimately he is living in Sodom. Okay, verse 13. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly, and sinners against Yahweh. It wasn't like Lot was not, it said not that they became that later on. It said that's what they were like. And so when Lot moved towards Sodom, he was already aware that this city was an exceedingly wicked city, but he thought he could handle it. We know that from the New Testament that Lot, at least at some measure, was a righteous man. He was still a follower of Yahweh, but he thought he could live around the wickedness of Sodom and it wouldn't touch him. And as he was to see, it did touch him. Verse 14, and Yahweh said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him. Now again, still another time that this covenant is going to be restated. God is not going to let Abram forget what he's going to do for him. And he said in verse 12, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Isn't that great? He said there was no way that Abram could probably understand large numbers, the fact that we might be able to understand today. But he said, just to give you an idea, look down. It's interesting that later on he says look up. But right now he says look down. Look at the dirt. Look at the dust. Could you count the grains of dust? No. Neither will you be able to count your descendants. And that's exactly what happened. And he says, arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Again, check it out, Abram. Move around a little bit. I want you to see what I'm going to give you. I want you to see what your descendants will possess. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to Yahweh. And again, Hebron is just up. Here's Bethel and Ai right here. Hebron is a little up toward the center of the land. So that's where he ended. First thing he did was to build an altar. Okay, chapter 14. Let's move on. Interesting chapter. We'll take this in a couple of couple of doses, because there is embedded within the chapter one of the most fascinating stories of an individual in the Old Testament. An individual who, if it were just what we read in chapter 14, this story would be forgotten almost. I mean, we know it's in the Bible, but no one would think much about it. But this individual shows up again in the New Testament. So we'll have to stop and look at who the individual is and how and it's the individual is Melchizedek. And so we'll look at Melchizedek later. But we're just going to look at the narrative first. First of all, something you got to realize about the ancient Near East of that time. We think it today in terms of nations, the nation of Iraq, later on maybe, or even then, the nation of Assyria, the nation of Babylon. That's when nations came to be big chunks of land, the nation of Israel and Judah, etc. But at this point, this early, not that long after the flood, they had more of what we would call city-states. In other words, instead of a city controlling a vast chunk of land, the city would be that city and maybe the land immediately surrounding the city. So in today's world, don't think of the country of Tarrant. Think instead of the geographical area of Tarrant, which includes several kingdoms. It includes the large kingdom of Arlington. It includes the somewhat smaller kingdom of Mansfield. It includes the much smaller kingdom of Kennedale. And it includes the tiny kingdom of Pantego. And each one of these would be ruled over by a king. And so we're going to mention several kings here, but don't see these kings as representing huge countries. They're really more like represented states. Like, for instance, when it gets down to Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom had a king, Gomorrah had a king. So if you look over here, there's several over here. Now, this area between this is the Tigris and Euphrates River. Between that was the plain of what's called the plain of Shinar, what we came to see as what we come to call Babylon. In this area, which was later to become Babylon, there were several powerful kings. And what the kings would do in those days, there was no way to really extend their kingdom and hold them together. So if they went to war over here, it's not like, at that point, it's not like we want to add them to our country so that our country gets bigger. More like we will defeat them and we'll take away all their money and take away anything we want. Their women, their children, we'll take those, and then we'll leave, but we'll require that they pay tribute to us. So every year we will send a delegation who will collect tribute from this other city, with the idea that you pay up or our army will be back and will exact vengeance on you. And so there were some cities over here that were independent cities ruled over by their own kings, but they paid tribute to some kings over here in what we later called Babylon. And they would every year send people to collect the tribute. Well, these people over here weren't seeing those folk, and that was a part of the problem. I mean, you didn't see them for a while, and so it's real easy to think, why are we paying tribute to these people who live hundreds and hundreds of miles away? And so sometimes what's called the vassal states, the states that paid the tribute, would say, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. Now, understanding that, let's look at chapter 14. At this war it's called the 4 kings against the 5 kings. Let's look at what happened. Verse 1. And it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemaber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these came as allies into the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea, or what we now call the Dead Sea. Okay, so the cities that they made war against were right over here. Let's see, I've got, Deb, would you give out some of these maps? And I don't know that I have enough for everybody. If you don't get a map, or if you're at home right now and you would like some of the maps that we use here, if you would just email me at ccbc.handouts, plural, at gmail.com. CCBC, this is all lowercase, ccbc.handouts@gmail.com. And all you got to do is just send that to me. You don't even have to say, here's what I want. I'll put you on the list, and I will send you, every week, I'll send you the handouts from the course. What we're sending right now are some maps which show, and I'll kind of show you on my little hand-drawn map up here, but these are some maps that show this area and sort of what was going on. So the kings that were the states paying the money were over here on the east side of the Jordan River, and on down to Sodom and Gomorrah, etc. And so they said, after 12 years of this, enough. We're not paying anymore. And so they said, no, we're not. And so maybe they sent a representative and they said, no, we're not paying you anymore. And so these kings over here, they get together, and I don't know whether they were paying to all those kings or whether they were only paying to one or two, and they got some more, because the idea is that we will send an army over there. Not only will we get our tribute, but we'll get everything else. We'll go in the city, anything we see. You see animals, you see money, you see possessions of any kind, we'll take it. And so it is really an enriching opportunity for these kings. And so these kings over here in Babylon are going to come over here and fight with these kings on the west side of the Jordan and down here on the west side of the Dead Sea. Okay, let's see. And they and in the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings. Now, Chedorlaomer is just listed as one of the kings, but then he's listed after this as sort of the lead dog in the coalition here. So maybe he was the leader of the coalition. Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and defeated Rephaim and Ashtaroth Kiriim, and Zuzim in Ham, and Emim in Shavath Kiriathim, and the Horites in Mount Seir as far as El Paran, which is in the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to El Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and conquered all the country of the Amalekites, the Amorites who lived in Hazazon Tamar. We'll look at where this is in a second. And the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, came out, and they arrayed for battle against them in the valley of Siddim, against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them. But those who survived fled into the hill country. So basically what happens is these kings come over here with their army, and every city they come to, they fight against and conquer. And so that's that list of all those places. And basically it is a north to south list. So they fought here, they fought here, they fought here, they fought here. And every time they came to a place, they took it. And not only did they want to conquer it, but they wanted to make sure there were no powerful enemies behind them, because they were moving south. Because it's down here that they fought the big battle against the kings in the southern part of the Dead Sea. There are tar pits down here. I don't know whether you've ever been or know about the La Brea tar pits in L.A. Same deal. Again, this was oil land. This word came up earlier, these tar pit kind of things, because when Nimrod was building the Tower of Babel, he discovered that they could make, there was not stone, and this was being built over here, but there was not stone in the land to build this. And so they discovered how to take mud and make it into bricks. And again, that would be adobe at that point. But what they discovered was that we can put these bricks into kilns and fire them, and we can make them much more durable. And to put the bricks together, they used this tar, because again, this was available. This is still an oil-rich kind of area. And so they went into these tar pits, not these, but some over here. They went into those tar pits and got that tar. And so they had kiln-dried bricks that were put together with tar. So they ended up fighting in this area, and whether this was a night campaign or whatever, but some of the guys actually fell into these things. And the bottom line is that the kings over here defeated their vassal servants over here, and just like one by one they knocked them off. They put together an army and they beat them down here, and now they're running. And so that means that they have already conquered all of these cities. Now look what happened. Verse 11. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. And they also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. And so they conquered Sodom and they conquered Gomorrah. They took everything of value, and also they took some of the leading citizens. Maybe they saw that these were people they wanted as part of their kingdom. Maybe it's that there might be some ransom value in these people. But they took Lot and pretty much everything he possessed out of Sodom. And so now the rebel kings are fleeing up into Palestine, and Chedorlaomer is after them. Verse 13, then a fugitive from the battle came, and told Abram the Hebrew. By the way, this is the first mention of the word Hebrew in the Bible. And the term is referring to an ancestor of Terah's called Eber, E-B-E-R. And that's where the term Hebrew comes from. And they're now becoming identified not just as a family of nomads, but as a people group. For he was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and the brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. So now he is living up here in the sort of north central part of Palestine. And there were some other tribes close by him that he had sort of worked up alliances with. And again, don't look at this as nations. Look at it as tribes, as nomadic tribes, or tribes who lived in cities, city-states or tribal areas and things like that. So there were some that he was living close by with that had Abram's respect and he theirs. And so that's the area in which he was living. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, Lot presented problems for Abram constantly. And so now Abram thought, okay, my brother's kid, my nephew, is he's off on his own. He's living over there on the west side of the Jordan. He's doing well. He's successful. Everything is good. And all of a sudden he gets a message that says, hey, listen, there's been a battle, which is part of a larger war, and they raided Sodom. They captured Sodom, and they got your nephew too. And notice that Abram, being the kind of guy that he is, still feels responsibility for his nephew Lot. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. We'll talk about that in a second. Abram had his own private army. Not really so much as army, but they were people who did other things. But Abram had trained them in security, obviously, and had put together his own little force in case there were need of them. There were 318. How many men were in the other army? We don't know. It was more than 318, though. This was a coalition of 5 kings. And so Abram set off pursuing a much larger army with a fighting force of 318, plus a coalition that Abraham put together of tribal leaders around him. And so maybe that doubled his army. Maybe we went from 318 to 600 or 700 or whatever. Whatever it is, it was probably a much smaller army. But again, Abram is really, number one, love my nephew, got to take care of my nephew. And number two, God's on our side. And we see that later on because he acknowledges later on that God has given the victory. And so this might remind you of Gideon. Remember when nights and God told you your army's too big, needs to be smaller. And ultimately Gideon attacked the Midianites with a force about like this. And we see this all the way through the Old Testament because God is determined that he be glorified and that people will see that you had the victory. But you didn't get the victory because you're such a great military tactician. You didn't get the victory because you had superior arms and materiel and because your army was bigger, etc. You got the victory because I gave it to you. You beat an army you shouldn't have beaten. And that's exactly what happened here. Abram shouldn't have beaten this army, but he did. He pursued them as far as it says he went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them in a night attack, and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back the goods, and he also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. And so basically fought them in here and pursued them all the way up here. Dan, the city of Dan did not exist at that point, but it was called something else. But Abram, writing hundreds of years later, knew that the people who read it in his day would see that as the city of Dan, that's the city they'd be familiar with. So Abram put in that Moses put in that designation. So defeated them here and then pursued them way up north of the Sea of Galilee, even north of Damascus. He pursued them a long way. He kept fighting them. They kept running. This is a larger army running from a smaller army, and God's giving them the victory. And ultimately, they defeated these people, and they took, and again, that's what they did in those days. When you defeated an army, you went in and helped yourself. And so they took all of the booty that army had, including Lot and his flocks, herds, anything they took from Lot. At this point, Abram comes back and meets with Melchizedek, and we're going to look at that next time, and we're going to look at what the significance of Melchizedek is and why this guy that is mentioned in only like 4 verses in the Old Testament gets whole chapters given to him in the book of Hebrews, and what the significance is of Melchizedek. So what we see here is the development of faith. We see a man who has failures like we do, a man who blows it, but a man who God does not give up on, and a man who is little by little developing faith. Faith is not an act, it's a process. And ideally, you have more now than you did a few years ago, but the good news is whatever. Because Abram is really showing great faith, and then in another couple of chapters, we'll see something it's like he's starting all over again almost. But God does not give up. And Abram ends up, this man who keeps on 2 steps forward, 3 steps back kind of faith, this man ends up in the New Testament when Paul wants to give us an example of faith. He chooses this guy who kept blowing it in the Old Testament. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you that you don't sugarcoat the heroes of the faith. that you don't act like these people were perfect and they never failed and they never had problems. You show us people who fail over and over and over again, and yet you love them, you're with them, and in the end, you demonstrate through this man, what a life of faith can be. Lord, build that in us. Thank you so much for your word. Thank you for the opportunity to look at it as we go into a worship service in a little while. We pray that you will speak to us today individually and meet needs in our lives. Lord, we love you. Thank you for this time together. In Jesus' name, amen.